Welcome to the class of 2003, our celebration of three of the best driving cars from an epic era. It doesn't seem all that long ago until you delve into some trivia, and then you start to feel a bit old. Bentley took a giant leap into the 21st century with the Continental GT, just as Aston Martin did with the DB9 and Lamborghini did with its new baby Gallardo. And of course, there was the hypercar holy trinity of the day, the Ferrari Enzo, Porsche Carrera GT and Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. And then there's this trio. The Porsche 996 GT3 RS, Ferrari 360 Challenge Stradale and BMW M3 CSL. Anyone around my age will remember seeing these cars on Top Gear back in the day, especially the GT3 RS and Challenge Stradale, which posted identical lap times in the hands of the Stig. Let me say up front that we're not trying to choose a winner here. Myself, Jonty and Miles will all fight the corner of the cars we're driving, of course, but really, we're here to celebrate what makes this era of cars so special. If you know me, it'll come as no surprise that I'm up first in the Porsche. Equally predictable is Jonty, who'll follow in the Ferrari. And for the wildcard BMW, we've roped in racing driver Miles Lacey. So, without further ado, let's go back to 2003. This is actually a totally new car to me. It's the only model of GT3 RS that I haven't driven yet. And somehow I've only ever driven one 996. It was a really leggy 3.4 Carrera on one of those experience days at an airfield when I was about 18. So I'm very grateful to the owner of this car for lending it to us and letting us see what all the fuss is about. Now the 996 as a whole wasn't particularly loved, but the GT3 RS is a whole different thing. When Chris Harris went round the Porsche GT mini museum, if you will, on a video recently, they both pointed at this and said, yeah, that's the one. It was the first car to wear the GT3 RS badge after the 993 Carrera RS, and really it marked the beginning of a new era for Porsche's GT division. It really does look properly motorsport on the outside, doesn't it, with the bright coloured wheels and the stickers and the big wing. Inside, it's a bit less shouty. In fact, it is really basic and Spartan in here. It comes from a time when no one cared about Apple CarPlay and heated seats or any of the fancy gimmicks, apart from a fire extinguisher, which hopefully we won't need. You fold yourself over this big roll cage, you've got bucket seats which go forwards and backwards, and then when you're on the move, you have a steering wheel with no buttons, 3 pedals, a stick, that's it. And really that lack of anything you don't really need is what we love so much about cars from this era. They were just simple driving machines. Now, noting that it's not incredibly loud from the outside, it's probably a good time to hand over for now to our resident Mr. Ferrari in a car that pretty much couldn't be any louder.
If it's noise you want, nothing quite abuses your eardrums like a 360 Challenge Stradale. Whoa! And unlike some of the more modern track specials, as you might call them, this was a true race car at heart, having been designed by the racing department and taking lots of the technology and parts from the 360 Challenge series cars. We're also still in early days of the F1 gearbox, so it is a little bit slow and it's really sort of showing its age, but it still does these lovely downshifts. When this car was designed, it was built in mind that the owners would probably use it about 20% of its time on track. and the other 80% as just a road car. Therefore it is quite well stripped out, but it still has a few creature comforts. I've still got air conditioning and a radio. Not that you'd ever want to put it on, because you never want to drown out that noise. It's mad, I can still remember the episode when both of these cars were covered on Top Gear, but I don't remember that one being in.
The CSL BMW M3. Where have you been all my life? So, the BMW M3 E46 CSL. Where do we start? The car has such a cult following that I'm a bit nervous, to be honest. I want to do this car justice. Let's cast our minds back to 2001, the Frankfurt Motor Show. BMW stepped onto the stage with their concept of a lightweight study at a time where that wasn't really the done thing. But how do you improve on the already blisteringly good BMW M3? After the overwhelming feedback from showcasing the car at the Frankfurt Motor Show, the BMW engineers had no choice. It had to go ahead. It became a real project. So what do? Well, they started with going really back to basics. Simple, basic laws of physics. The only way to improve an already incredible car like the BMW M3 was to make it lighter. That was no easy task, and they made it a lot lighter. The car's weighing in at 1,385 kilos. That's 110 kilos lighter than the standard car. And remember, this is at a time where cars weren't overly heavy at the time anyway. You know, we're talking over 10, 15 years ago now. We just accept that cars are pretty heavy these days. So how do they do it? Well, we've got thinner glass on the rear window. We've got a carbon roof. That saved 7 kilos on its own. And not forgetting that that's saving the weight in one of the most important areas of the car, bringing the center of gravity much lower down, improving the car's dynamic ability. But it's everything else. You couldn't get air conditioning in the car, there was no stereo, they were offered back as no-cost options, fair enough. But even down to the carpets, the foam under the carpet was optimized for the weight, just to save those extra few pounds. On top of that, we've got carbon door cards, we've got fiberglass bucket seats. Everything about it, they didn't leave a thing to chance. Even the sound deadening, they reduced massively, which actually, with an engine like that, is no problem at all. I want to hear everything that engine has got to throw at me.
What you can hear behind me is a 3.6 litre race-derived Metzger engine. It has 385 horsepower and 284 foot-pounds of torque, which, you know, it barely sounds like it'll cut the mustard in a hot hatch these days. But remember, this weighs barely over 1,300 kilos. So it'll do 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds, and believe me, it pulled a lot more than I expected it to. Now that lightweight shines through on much more than just acceleration, but we'll get onto that a bit later. For now, let's stick to that engine, because it really is a big talking point that obviously they don't put in the modern day GT3s. As with any GT3, the throttle response, bam, it's just right there and the revs just shoot up. The power band, it does pay to rev it. It goes from lower down, but it just pulls all the way to the top end, all the way to the red line at 8,000, and then you've got an excuse to use this awesome manual gearbox. Now, I wouldn't say it's quite as sweet as the one in the 997 GT3. In fact, that one may well be the best manual gearbox I've ever used, but it's great. Now at the top end there, It's not quite as screamy and loud as a newer GT3, but you get that GT3 howl lower down. If anything, I'd say it sounds quite like an air-cooled 911. You get that low-pitched thrum with a bit of a whine accompanying it, and it's just also mechanical. It's got a single-mass flywheel, so at idle, when you lift your foot off the clutch, it gives you this chuntering noise that would probably make you think it's broken if you didn't know otherwise. But the great thing about it is it's so real. There is just nothing fake about how this car sounds. And that translates over to the whole experience, really, that there's nothing fake about the car as a whole. There are no electrical nannies, there's nothing sort of enhancing anything. It just is what it is. It's here for the driver. It's not going to impress anyone at the side of the road when they ask you to rev it, but that's not the point. It's here to grab by the scruff of the neck and just be this pure experience.
Power-wise, Ferrari had a bit of a tinker, but they only managed to increase power by a measly 25 brake horsepower over the standard 360 Modena. But instead they were concentrating more on making it more lightweight and improving its handling characteristics. So the Stradale sits a lot lower than a standard 360. And because of the weight saving, it's 110 kilograms lighter. They also wanted to improve the braking, so they gave it carbon ceramics from a Ferrari Enzo. They work well, really well. So despite that little power increase, the 360 Challenge Stradale lapped the Fiorano test track 3.5 seconds faster than a standard Modena.
The engine in the CSL is definitely its party piece. It's a real showstopper. That S54 engine is cast iron, literally and figuratively. 3.2 litres, inline 6, 355 horsepower, 370 newton meters of torque. Yeah, okay, those numbers are not going to blow anybody away by today's standards, but that's just not what it's about. That's not what this car's about at all. I've never driven a car that is as balanced and as communicative as this is. There's no exaggeration whatsoever, and that isn't the BMW fanboy in me talking either. The one thing, if you've ever heard a CSL driving past, is the noise. That distinctive inline 6 noise it produces is fantastic in the standard car, but in the CSL it is absolutely something else. It is something else. It revs out to 8,000 RPM. 8,000 RPM. If you leave it in third and rev it all the way out to the top of third from low revs, it sounds like no other car you've ever experienced. At the time when the engine was released, it was actually the highest power output of its kind in a 6-cylinder engine. 111 brake horsepower per litre. Unbelievable. Of course, some things had to change, so we've got a much larger air intake, we've got a carbon manifold, change in the cam profiles. God, those small changes really, really come together to make the engine in the CSL an absolute masterpiece.
So I've said this before when I've driven GT3s, GT4s, as good as the engines are, they're really all about handling, aren't they? So let's get on to that, because the lightweight I mentioned really translates over into the handling. Now, the first thing that really strikes you compared to newer GT3s is just how much it moves around on the road. you kind of look like you're in an old American film with a green screen behind you, because you're always doing something with the wheel, even in a straight line. Front end on it is great, but you really feel like it's worth having some weight over the nose with the brakes. One of those cars that, even though it's not stupid powerful, it's probably a bit of a learning curve to really get to grips with. Now the steering. Oh, the steering, man. At low speeds, it's not very assisted at all. It's quite heavy, which I like. And when you get up to speed, as you can probably see, every little ripple in the road is just coming through. And it feels like you're going fast. The brakes as well. Yet another thing that comes from that lightweight. Great stopping power. The traction out of the bends. Awesome. And I don't think I'd believe you if you said this has 375 horsepower. It really does feel pretty quick. Now this has passive dampers rather than adaptive dampers like every GT3 RS since. So obviously you lose that adjustability. You do lose a bit of ride comfort when you're just cruising around, but it's a well-judged middle ground that seems to just work all over. And when you do jump in something like this, not having any decisions of what mode do I want that in, what mode do I want the steering in, what mode do I want the dampers in, or the throttle response. This makes you realise you don't need any of that.
Now, unless you're comparing it to a Ferrari F40 or an F50, there isn't really anything else quite as coarse as a Strad. Everything's so raw, and the noise from that V8 engine as it screams. The rack could have been a bit quicker, but there's so much feel to it that you can just tell what the car's doing all of the time, right up until you thump those Enzo brakes. The only thing is, with 360 Challenge Stradale, unlike its modern day counterparts like the Skoda or the Speciale, you can't really just switch off and cruise in it in the same way. It's constantly egging you on to thrash its nuts off.
I suppose it would be rude during a BMW review not to talk about the driving dynamics just a little bit. I suppose I had a few preconceptions in my head. First and foremost being, everybody absolutely slates the gearbox. They slate it to the point where I thought, my God, this actually is going to be terrible. It's going to be undrivable. But in my opinion, it actually adds to the experience. With the ESP off, there's actually a little secret menu where you can increase the ferociousness of the gear changes, but I haven't actually found that I've needed to do that, if I'm perfectly honest with you. Okay, it's a little bit slow to come up and down, but it's not really impacting my driving experience too much. The steering's beautifully weighted. BMW are so good at doing steering. Of course, this was of the hydraulic era, so okay, let's not get too caught up on that, but it is a masterpiece in steering feel. The communication through the front axle is brilliant. Okay, the brakes aren't fantastic. They did actually uprate them over the standard car, but notoriously and historically, BMW M car brakes aren't actually that good, and that's why a lot of people tend to upgrade them. I can pick an apex, I can steer the car in, I can balance the car on the throttle. It just feels like a driver's car. Everything down to the steering position. BMW just always absolutely nailed that. I'm sat nice and low in the car. Yeah, okay, helped by the bucket seats somewhat, but they always allow you to get nice and low, pedals in the perfect position, and the steering wheel all the way close to the chest. I just feel like the car is just shrinking around me. In my slightly more serious job, if you will, I'm a development driver. That's what I do. We develop chassis for road cars, and it's no easy task. A road car is always compromised in some way, of course, but BMW, certainly at this time, early 2000s, were just getting it so right. So many dynamics engineers that I work with, have worked with over the years, either own or have owned a BMW M3. Need I say any more?
This might get thrown around a bit much, but put simply, they don't make them like this anymore. And frankly, I don't think buyers would accept them like this anymore. These days, we want everything all the time, and these cars do not do that. They have one job, to thrill the driver, and they're all masters of it. It was a different market back then too. You didn't buy these cars to flip, to pose, or to get on the list for the next one. You bought them because you were a through and through petrol head who didn't care about anything but driving thrills. They're all refreshingly back to basics. You sit in sparse interiors in bucket seats which slide forwards or backwards, and that's it. The steering wheels aren't covered in buttons, there are no big screens, and there's carbon everywhere. I'm not talking about aesthetic splashes of carbon that add 100 grand in options either. No, these cars had carbon for the sole purpose of lightness. And in terms of spec, you pretty much got what you were given. There was no paint to sample, no interior frills, and almost no options. I'll admit that it's hard to make an objective argument for these cars over their modern day counterparts, which have all become far faster, more capable, more usable, and much safer. But think subjectively, and the old dogs show the most charming tricks. They were made to be driven, and driven hard at that. Nothing more, nothing less. In some ways, they were the first of their kind, and in others, they were the last of their kind. And however Jonty, Miles or myself argued for each of the cars we were driving today, what we can all agree on is that all three of them give some of the most pure, engaging and exciting experiences of anything on four wheels. So that is the class of 2003. Tell us your favourite in the comments below, and let us know which era you think we should feature next.